He came in the door, he's just using the restroom, and he'll be right up.
All right.
Yeah,
Okay, Marianne.
I just made it my first announcement. First announcement, do that.
yeah, everyone said he won't start it.
All right, these are the ones that stayed around. Sorry we lost over half of the people. You may have heard the call to have more people come back. So let's welcome our congressman from the 1st Congressional District, Brian Fitzpatrick.
Should we wait for more people to come, or what should we do? Are we serving food tonight?
No.
I haven't eaten yet. I'm really hungry.
Me too.
I heard the food's really good here.
Me too.
Yeah? So, thank you all for inviting me. I'm sorry for the confusion. We actually were for about 14 years. And I traveled the country from coast to coast. I started in New York City, domestically, ended up in Los Angeles, and in the interim across the globe throughout Europe and Africa and Asia and the Middle East. And some pretty amazing assignments. And one of my assignments was working in the political corruption unit at FBI headquarters, which is a pretty interesting job when you get to do that, for sure. But one of the things that I started to do my very first day was to work on some of the government reform packages. My very first day, I introduced a term limits amendment to the Constitution. It's something that I believe in very, very stridently. You know, if you look at a lot of the states that have them, and there's several states across the country, but when I first started in Congress, that was the first thing that I introduced because I'm a big believer in it. I'm a big believer in a citizen legislature. I think if it makes sense for the president, it makes sense for the legislature to have a term limit where, sorry? Oh. Is the microphone turned on? Okay. Sorry. Can you hear me? Some people can hear me, some people can't. Is that better? So, returning to a citizen legislature is something that's very, very important to me. I felt that way before I was in the FBI. It was only reinforced during my time in the FBI. That I think that not only is this what our founders intended, but it's also what's good for our country. That you have people that go in, put in their time, a limited period of time, go home, live under the laws they help pass, make way for a new generation of leadership. I think that's the healthiest form of democracy. I think that's the most organic form of democracy. And I think that's one thing that our country really needs. The second thing our country really needs, and I think these aren't 1 and 2, these are 1 and 1, is to re-usher in an era of bipartisanship. So important. The second thing I did on my first day in Congress was join something called the Problem Solvers Caucus. It's a bipartisan group. The only true, functioning on a daily basis, I would say, bipartisan organization in Congress. We meet every single week we're in session. And what we believe is that no one party has a monopoly on good ideas, that the solutions to all of our problems and the way every single relationship in our lives works, whether it be a personal relationship, a business relationship, a financial relationship, is that we bring the best and brightest ideas together from all walks of life. We sometimes sacrifice ourselves to get something in return, and the byproduct is always the best path forward. And that's something that we certainly did in the FBI. Anytime we had a time-sensitive crime problem of any sort, we would surround the table with people from completely different backgrounds. And what we found is that based on our upbringing, based on where we went to school, what jobs we had, the family we grew up in, the part of the country or the world that we experience, that really affects the approach or how you approach a problem. And the more different and diverse backgrounds we can bring to the table, the better solutions we came to. And we've seen that happen many times in the FBI. We were able to get one step ahead of a criminal only because we brought that diverse perspective to the table. And we extracted the best and brightest of all backgrounds. Very important. And also the issue of bipartisanship. You know, we are a caucus that is split equally down the middle. We're roughly 46 members. And the rule in the problem solvers is that if you want to join, you have to find somebody from the opposite party to join with you. So if you're a Republican, you have to find a Democrat to join with you. If you're a Democrat, you have to find a Republican to join with you. And that's a good rule, right? Because what we believe in is equality in thought, diversity in thought, and that the best bills we can advance are those that are bipartisan. And if you look at the best bills in the history of our country, they're bipartisan. Because people register with different parties for all different reasons when they're 18 years old. So that should never define who we are. It should never define how we think. It should never define who we support. Every one of us are called upon to be Americans first, to be independent thinkers, and to support people based on what they believe and how they go about solving problems. Their perspectives, their paradigms is very, very important. So that's really the premise of the problem solvers, is to do just that. I'm a proud member of that organization. Sometimes it comes at you get a little bit of grief for being in that center sometimes. You get the people on the far left and the far right that aren't real happy with you. But we're not a far left or far right country. We are a centrist country. We're a pragmatic country. We're a country that believes in problem solving, not in partisanship. We have real problems in our country, and what I would ask every one of you to do is what I do, what I ask of myself, what I ask of my colleagues and friends, is when you're assessing people, whether it be in government, whether it be in business, whether it be people here, try to find the best and brightest aspects of them. We could spend all day, every day, finding the negative traits about each other and tearing each other down. What does that accomplish? Do they have experience in the business field that I've never experienced? Do they have experience in law enforcement? Website, take a look at what's on there, let me know if you agree or disagree with the premises. Because the premises on that website are what we believe as a caucus. NoLabels.org.
Would you give that website again so people can...
No Labels, NOLABELS.org. Okay? I will tell you, if you want to know everything you need to know about me, go to that website. And those are the principles that I believe in to my core. Those are the principles that I fight for. Is if we can get rid of this Hatfield-McCoy environment, where it's red state versus blue state, liberal versus conservative, left versus right, I reject all of those notions. There's right and wrong. There's things that make sense and things that don't make sense. That's got to be our new criteria. On all the challenges we face, let's start with healthcare. Every single one of us, by virtue of the fact that we are living and breathing and walking this planet, need a healthcare system that works. We need a healthcare system that's affordable, one that's innovative, and that is providing incentives for new cures and new treatments to diseases and ailments, and one that's universally accessible. We all need that. This is a product that encompasses 1/5 of our economy and it impacts 100% of the American people. How is that a partisan issue? We all want and need the same things out of that. Immigration. The last time we've rewritten our immigration laws is a real rewrite of immigration reform, 1986, 31 years ago. Think of all the things that have changed in our country. Think of all that's changed on the border. Think of all that's changed in our relationships between the U.S. and Mexico, and all that's changed in foreign policy. 31 years. You know the reason why it hasn't gotten done? Because you got the far left and the far right fighting, digging in and allowing the perfect in their mind to be the enemy of the good, rather than doing what every single one of us do in our lives. Compromise. Build consensus. You're not going to get everything you want all the time, nor should you in any aspect of our life. That's the way Congress needs to work. That is what the Problem Solvers Caucus believes. That's what we are about. That's what we're fighting for. To expand from the center out. To eliminate this Hatfield-McCoy extreme nonsense. Because that is what is destroying our country. That's what I believe. So I want to thank you for inviting me out. I apologize for my tardiness. We were coming from another event. And do we have a Q&A here, or how does this work?
Okay, I have the questions that were asked of the previous speaker. I think you just addressed this with term limits, put that one aside. This one is Social Security. What is your position on Social Security and why? Privatizing.
My position on Social Security or on
Privatizing Social Security at this point.
Social Security should not be privatized. Social Security is a bedrock foundational principle in our country. It is a critical part of our social safety net. It goes to the core of what it means to be American. My parents, both in their mid-80s, are living off of their Social Security. They live in the same house and they raised 8 kids. I'm the youngest of the 8, I'm the baby. They live in that same house and they survive on it. And I love my parents dearly, I love them to death, and they survive on it. This is a fundamental promise and commitment that the American people throughout generations have made to our elderly population. And we're all going to get to that age, hopefully, God willing. And we need that in place. It's got to be protected unequivocally. It's got to be funded unequivocally. And there's a couple of pieces of legislation that I've introduced that I believe will make Social Security even better and expansive. Number one is a no tax on Social Security funds. Social Security is a product of taxation. It's a product of all the work and effort that each and every one of us have put into the system. It's a repayment of that. Since it's a product of taxation, it should not be taxed upon disbursement. So Social Security benefits should be tax-free. The second thing is Social Security benefits need to keep pace with inflation. We're all familiar with a concept called CPI, the Consumer Price Index. That's basically what measures inflation. So $20 today is not worth the same as $20 last year because prices go up, consumer products go up, the cost of services go up. If your amount stays the same, but prices are going up, that's a de facto reduction. And that's not okay. So not only should we attach it to CPI, we should attach it to CPIE, Consumer Price Index for the elderly, which oftentimes is much higher than the standard CPI. Because the elderly population, sometimes the products and services they buy or they engage in are more expensive, prescription medication, healthcare services, and the like. So not taxing Social Security benefits, attaching the payment stream to CPI so it keeps track with inflation so the real purchasing power doesn't decrease is very, very important. And the third thing that's critically important is having an economy that grows at a clip that can adequately fund all of our social safety net programs, including public education, including defending our environment and protecting our environment, including Social Security, including Medicare, including Medicaid, including giving a pay raise to our troops who are putting their lives on the line every day. You need a healthy economy to do that. An economy that's growing at 1.6% growth in GDP cannot do that. An economy that's growing at 3 and 4% can do that. And that's why that's an important piece of the puzzle as well. We have to have an unequivocal, unapologetic perspective that we are going to protect Social Security at all costs. And we also have to have a commitment to grow the economy at a healthy enough clip where there's enough revenue in the government to fund these programs. You need both. You can't have one without the other. And that's my view on Social Security.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on. Let me see what we have here. Okay, drug prices. That's a question that comes up. What can be done to lower the deficit? Okay, that's a deficit. What can be done to lower drug prices? Just go with that.
Yeah. So you start with transparency in the pharmaceutical industry. You start with competition, right? There has to be competition in industries, including the pharmaceutical industry, to reduce prices. The price of prescription medication is absurd. It's absurd. And my parents feel the pinch of this, as many of you I'm sure do, and as many people do across the community, that taking medication that is sustaining your life and sustaining your quality of life should not be cost prohibitive. It should not be the most significant item in your budget. And yet it is. And many of the reasons for that are a lack of transparency and lack of competition. And when you look at the healthcare sector, given that this is a product that we all need, we got to take a real hard look at intermediaries in that chain. And when you learn cost accounting, you study accounting, you look at the supply chain, and there's things that happen all along the supply chain from raw material to finished product. Some things add cost and value. Some things add cost only and no value. Some things add a lot of value at a minimal cost. That's all part of the cost accounting equation. We need to take a really hard look at what that supply chain is in the prescription medication field. And if there are middlemen and non-value added intermediaries along the way that are adding costs but not adding any value at the end product, that's basically just a pure cost passed on to the consumer that's not adding any value, and you have a financial beneficiary in the middle that probably shouldn't be there. So competition and transparency are the two keys to doing that.
According to the AARP, drug prices rose 12.5% in 2013, and inflation was 1.5%. In 2015, drug prices were up 6.4%, and inflation was 0.2%. What can be done to minimize the difference between inflation and the increase in drug prices? Is there anything that the Congress could do?
Sure. Well, I think tying benefits to inflation and the CPIE is critically important on the payment stream side. And on the cost side, we need to take a hard look at the pharmaceutical pricing structure. One of the things I talked about in the college education field, and this is kind of a common theme because a big issue we're facing now is the cost of college education and how expensive it is. And what we talked about, a solution, is having a transparency model where any education that's getting federal funding, and that's a jurisdictional hook that we have as a federal government agency. We try to regulate any institution. If they're getting federal dollars, we can tie those federal dollars to certain requirements. And requiring that colleges and universities identify that for every dollar of college tuition, what percent of that dollar is going to educating the students? What percent is going to placing those students in jobs? What percent of that is salaries? What percent of it is administrative overhead? To get that clear picture of where that cost is going. I think the same ought to be done for pharmaceuticals. We need to take a look at what the cost of producing those drugs is, what the R&D cost is, what the manufacturing cost is, what the marketing cost is, what cost is overhead, what's the profit, and who's profiting. This is healthcare. This isn't creating widgets. This is healthcare. This is what people need to live. And we got to take a good hard look at that.
Do you support letting Medicare negotiate with prescription drug prices?
Yes.
And how? How we can do that?
Well, it's a simple regulatory change that I support. I think that you need, competition, negotiation, anything that's going to bring down costs is very, very important. Medical expenses are absurd across the board. The number one cause of personal bankruptcy in this country, the number one cause, medical bills. Think about that. A product that we all need to live and to survive. And it's the number one cause of personal bankruptcy. We need to take a hard look at the pricing structure across the healthcare sectors, including pharmaceuticals.
Should Americans be allowed to buy lower priced drugs from other countries?
Yes.
Isn't there some federal organization that is trying to stop that?
Well, I mean, the FDA always, the FDA exists to, test these drugs out, so that's always a concern. And certainly there's a role for the FDA. Of course there is. They need to test the efficacy of these drugs. I had a lot of interaction with the FDA this year, and one of the more significant bills that I passed through the House, through the Senate, got signed into law this year, is something called the right to try. It dealt primarily with people with terminal illnesses. It was inspired largely by people in the ALS community who came to us and said, it takes about 10 to 12 years to get a drug fully through the FDA pipeline. And yet, once diagnosed with, for example, ALS, your lifespan is typically 2 to 5 years. So those people came, rightfully so, and said, what are we to do here? There are a lot of great experimental drugs, some from small pharmaceutical companies in this country, some from international or overseas companies, one being in Israel, for example, for ALS. These patients did not have access to those drugs. So they came to us and say, why don't we have the right to try? If things aren't fully all the way through the FDA pipeline, but they're through phase 1 of the FDA pipeline, which is the safety protocol to make sure that it's safe and it won't kill you. And there's physician certification, there's patient certification, manufacturer liability certification. All boxes are checked, and they have no other way to go, and they've exhausted all other remedies. Why not give them that hope? And why not give their parents and their children and their siblings and their family the peace of mind of knowing that they left no stone unturned? Why not? That law didn't exist until this year. I offered the bill. We got it through the House, through the Senate, signed into law by the President. The FDA had concerns with it. We worked with them. They play an important role in that process.
Okay, let's turn to taxes. Is there going to be further tax decreases? Is that on the agenda?
So what's the key with tax reform, just like with regulatory reform, is finding that point of equilibrium. So there are tax rates that are too high in some cases, there are tax rates that are too low in some cases, and it's a question of macro and microeconomics. Where is that point of equilibrium? Where is that sweet spot? Where tax rates aren't so high that you're bleeding revenue to the government, that they're crushing job growth, but not so low that you're bleeding revenue to the government. Same thing with regulatory reform. You can't have regulations that are so duplicative and redundant that they're crushing job growth, but you can't have them so efficient that they're not providing adequate protection for environmental preservation, for workforce safety standards and the like. It's a matter of finding that sweet spot, that point of equilibrium for both tax reform and regulatory reform, and that needs to be a work in progress. But the one thing that was for certain, that when you have a tax code that was written in 1986, that was over 70,000 pages long, that was riddled with loopholes and special interest deductions, that only people that could hire really expensive, sophisticated tax attorneys can navigate, that's not an engine for economic growth. And I think because of that, you saw the slow economic growth rate for a long period of time. We went from under 2% rate, extended period of time, to 2.7% growth last year, to 4.1% economic growth last quarter. That's really important because, and unemployment has dipped below 4%. What that translates into is increased revenues in the national government, which allows us to fund all the programs we're talking about tonight.
How can large permanent decreases be justified for the top 1%?
Well, the tax reform, I mean, it's always a question, like I said, it's always a question of equilibrium and finding that sweet spot. So there's two questions on tax reform. Number one, what does it do to individual take-home pay? Number two, what does it do to economic growth? And that's always the question, right? So one of the reasons why I'm a big believer in candidates disclosing their tax returns, it says a lot. You can do the calculation for yourself, right? If all candidates who are debating tax reform want the real answer to the question, we give up our tax returns, the opponent gives up their tax returns, you use the old tax code and calculate the numbers, you use a new tax code and calculate the numbers, and you see who's benefiting, right? Seems pretty straightforward, pretty transparent. That's what I believe. Should be.
Another question, what can be done to lower the deficit with, oh yeah, I think you just, okay. What can be done to lower the deficit without decreasing Social Security and Medicare benefits? Which I think you pretty much just addressed. So that's, okay, are there any other questions that weren't covered with my buddy? Andy, do you want, or George, you want to see what, do we have a question there? Okay, Andy's getting a question from...
I don't have a question, but I have a statement. I like your idea of working together to get an answer to something. I hate it when people are so separated and fighting so much against each other. I like the idea that you want to come and talk together and settle something that way. Good for you.
Thank you.
Really.
I think that's a very important point. As Brian pointed out, there's been too much of the extremes. This is a centrist economy or a centrist population. I feel there's about 15% on the left and 15% on the right and the 70% in the middle. Better get up and do something about it. So let's hope that Brian's conciliatory attitude infuses the whole Congress and we get something done rather than, it ain't my idea, we ain't going to do it. All right, we have a question back
If you
there.
could, I would, again, encourage you guys to go to that website, and I really do want your feedback on nolabels.org. Take a hard look at everything they propose, everything they believe is needed to save our country, and I want to hear your feedback on that. Because everything in there is what I believe.
Bill's got it. Bill has a question.
Bill, let me see what you got.
I got you, Bill.
Okay, you can't quite read what Bill's talking about, but he's looking at probably NAFTA or trade. If you buy from other countries, what do you get? Right, Bill? That was the question as he wrote it. You want to speak to NAFTA or trade?
What was the question?
The way he wrote it, if you buy from other countries, what do you get? I guess he's looking at trade.
Yeah, so with trade, it has to be fair trade. We all believe in free trade, it's got to be fair. As many of you probably know, I'm a big believer in organized labor and our unions. They've supported me in this campaign, and I'm very, very close with them, supporting the working families, the middle class families. Trade is a big component of that. And I'm also a big believer in environmental conservation. So this is always comes up in trade, that we need expansive trade. We live in a global economy, and we need that. But we also have to be very cognizant that in our country, we have certain labor standards that we cannot compromise, and we have certain environmental standards that we cannot compromise. And we can't engage in trade with countries that are essentially going to create a race to the bottom. We can't do that. So we have to expand in free trade, but it's got to be fair, and it's got to raise other countries up to our standards for the labor and for the environment, not reduce ours.
The question that was just brought up, it's basically on gun control. What is your intention about this killing from people with guns all over the country? That's obviously a gun control question.
Yeah. Well, we can start by you on. Sorry. Yeah. So does everybody here know who Gabby Giffords is? Yeah. So Gabby Giffords is supporting us for this reason. There's a lot of issues in Congress that people consider third rail issues. They're afraid to touch them. I'm a freshman, and my perspective was very clear on day one. If you don't touch them, you can't fix them. This wristband that I'm wearing, this was from the father of a beautiful young girl who died in Parkland, who I encountered in the Cannon Tunnel on my way to voting in Washington, D.C. I've met those kids, I've met the parents. It is heartbreaking. And are these tough issues to deal with? Of course they are. Of course they are. But we have to step up and lead. And there are certain common sense things that we know we can do, that we have to do, that have not gotten done under Congresses that were controlled by both Republicans and Congresses that were controlled by Democrats. Both have failed. They failed in this area, they failed in immigration, they failed in a whole host of areas. Again, I will come back to this essential point, because of the partisan extremes. That's why they failed. You have this Hatfield and McCoy environment where they spend more time fighting rather than coming together to the table to say, what can I learn from you? Just because people think differently from us doesn't make them dumb. It means they've experienced different things that we haven't. We should want to learn from that. Now, on the issue of this, some things that are no-brainers that should have been done a long time ago. Universal background checks. By the way, back to the No Labels Problem Solvers Caucus. We have a gun safety, school safety agenda that our entire caucus adopted. A slate of legislative bills that our caucus has adopted in a bipartisan fashion. Democrats and Republicans came together and said, if this package is brought to the floor, we're going to vote as a block together for it. And there's a whole host of things, to include universal background checks, to include gun violence restraining orders, to include a whole host of bills, and you can look them up on the internet. Common sense things. We understand and we want to protect constitutional rights. Of course we do. We want to protect people's ability to keep themselves safe in their homes and to protect themselves and their loved ones. Of course we do. But that doesn't mean that we should be afraid to take common sense steps to protect our communities, protect our families, protect our kids in school. We can't be afraid to do that. And again, it gets back to this governing from the center. It's so important, and it is what our country needs now more than ever. It's so important. We have to get away from these extremes on both sides.
There is a question here of reintegrating convicts or into the community and the society.
Yep.
And is there anything that the federal government can do to improve the ability and the possibility of bringing these people back up to where we would like to see it?
Yes.
What can they do?
In fact, the Problem Solvers created something. It's called the First Step Act. And I encourage you to look that up. It's basically referring to the reentry program. So there was a Department of Justice initiative when I was in the Department of Justice, the prison reentry program. The reality that we have in this country, and it gets into what should be legal and illegal and who we're putting in prisons. That's the first question that we need to take a hard look at. But when it comes to reentry, the overwhelming majority of people, and I know this from my time as a prosecutor and as an FBI agent, roughly about 80 to 85% of people in prison are going to be released at some point. They're going to re-enter society. So, given that reality, what are we doing while they're incarcerated to prepare them so that when they get out of prison, they're not causing more problems, they're not entering a life of poverty with no skill set and nowhere else to turn but drugs and recidivism? What hope are we giving them? What training are we giving them in prison to prepare them for re-entry? That's really, really important. So it goes to how the Bureau of Prisons operates, what their training programs are they certifying and educating these inmates? Are they preparing them for release? Because if they're going to be released at the clip of 80%, they owe a duty to all of us to make sure that these are people that can be reacclimated in the community, that they can get jobs, that they're not going to be stigmatized, that they're going to be able to financially sustain themselves and their family, that they're not going to go down the path of crime again, that they're not going to go down the path of addiction.
Excuse me. My question was for people who are not incarcerated and are doing well on probation, they cannot legally find jobs. For somebody who wants to improve their life to do better, for somebody who wants to do better after exiting prison, it is so hard for them to hold a job while they have to complete programs that they don't need because the judge told them they have to complete it. When they are doing well on probation and doing the things that they need to be doing, McDonald's isn't going to support the future. You can't retire on that. I mean, isn't there something that can be where they can make $15-20 an hour, like to gain, like in janitorial, and work their way up, maybe even as an executive? That's my question.
Yeah.
Not about being incarcerated, it's
Right.
about the people who are not incarcerated.
Right. But are you saying people that were recently released?
Well, they could be on probation for
Right.
anywhere 3 years to 4
Right.
years to 10 years, and it's so hard to find a job because they're instantly judged on their background rather than how they're doing now.
There you go, and that's the problem. Stigma is a problem in so many aspects in our life, and it's a problem here. It's a problem with addiction, stigmatizing drug addiction. It's a problem with people that have previously served prison sentences. If we believe that, if we're going to acknowledge reality, that these people are re-entering society as they are, we have to prepare for that. And part of that is eliminating that stigma. Part of it, to your point, is offering, and this is where government can step in, offering financial incentives to companies to hire people who have been released, to give them that hope, because that is the key to so many of these situations, where you have people that are in a tough circumstance and they're trying to get out of it. The key in almost all these cases is giving them that light at the end of the tunnel. That's a key to overcoming drug addiction. It's a key to overcoming what you're talking about.
For
If
somebody
we have a
that's not
percent,
on drugs,
I'm sorry.
for somebody that is not on drugs, and for, you know, there's so many, you can't get a job, like,
Right.
somebody who's stuck on SSI
Mhm.
and welfare,
Mhm.
and they wanna do better, but
Right.
they can't because they're constantly looked down on from their pays,
Right.
when they should be looked at as doing better.
Absolutely. No, there are companies that incentivize and seek to hire people like that, and we need a lot more. And we need to incentivize that. Because I couldn't agree with you more. That is something that it requires a business community to come together with government and a whole host of other entities. But stigma is a huge problem. Offering that hope, offering financial incentives for companies to do that, giving people a hand where they need it. Because some people are coming into the workforce under really difficult circumstances. They really are. We need to be sympathetic to that. And it benefits all of us to have a framework in place that helps those people. Because having people that are struggling to find work, people that are dealing with stigma, people that are dealing with addiction, that doesn't only impact them, it impacts the entire community. It has a ripple effect. We've got to lift all those people up.
I'm a CNA. But my question to you, Mr. Congressman, is that about the gun control. Okay. Now, what will you do, or as a congressman, you represent everybody right now. What will you do about these guns that are floating everywhere, that even a baby who was born yesterday can apprehend a gun to shoot? Look at the indiscriminate killings that are going around. Like yesterday, a worker who took the gun and killed those people and killed herself. Look, all these killings are going around. Innocent lives are lost, Congressman. Yeah. What is your intention, or what will be your intention about these guns?
And again, the problem. Yeah. So so a big piece of this. Well, there's multiple pieces of this, right? So there's a legislative piece to it, where we need to enact a whole host of legislative schemes. And if you go to the Problem Solvers Caucus website, you can look at all of them. There's about 7 or 8 of them, I believe, that will satisfy the legislative piece. There's a mental health component to this, which is really, really important that we have to address. The most under-recognized, underdiagnosed problem we have in the United States of America is mental illness. And it's also stigmatized, and it's undertreated. And then there's the law enforcement piece of this. You know, when you look at a lot of these scenarios, it's always reactive, right? When you look at the Pulse nightclub shooting, after that, the big focus was no fly, no buy. You look at the Las Vegas shooting, all of a sudden the bump stock issue comes up. Everything's always reactive. The Parkland shooting with, the raising the age from 18 to 21. It seems like the government's always responding and reacting rather than getting out in front of this. There are certain pieces of legislation that are universally, unfortunately not universally enough, but should be universally accepted as helping solve the problem on the legislative front. And part of these legislative packages have not been able to see the daylight on the floor of the House under both Democrat and Republican control of the House of Representatives, which is why the Problem Solvers Caucus is so important. Because with all the packages that we've come to bipartisan consensus on, gun safety, immigration, healthcare, prison reform, infrastructure, they have not been able to get to the floor. So what the Problem Solvers Caucus did in response to that was create the Break the Gridlock rules change package, which will fundamentally change the way Congress works to make sure that all 435 members of the House have a voice. We have 435 members of the House of Representatives. 435 ought to have a voice because all 435 represent roughly 700,000 people in this country. Every single one of them should be entitled to a minimum of one legislative priority that they get full committee markup on and a full floor vote on the floor of the House of Representatives. And I will tell you that I've stood in front of the Capitol with many of my Democrat colleagues calling for these bold changes, including gun safety legislation. And it's this reason, man, that Gabby Giffords, who's a Democrat member of Congress, is endorsing us in this election. Because she appreciated the courage that we showed this year as a freshman under very difficult circumstances, stepping out on a difficult issue, taking leadership, not being afraid to take the criticism. And she's all in for us this cycle.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Certainly appreciate you coming, and sorry that we didn't have the full group here, but I'm sure that it will be told to some of the other people. We have our own in-house organ here, and they'll take some notes and make your positions available to them. So thank you very much, sir. And
Thank you all for inviting me. It's a pleasure being here. Thanks.
oh yeah, he'll stay around for a little while
They work together.
if you have something you want to talk to him about.